Recording.
Ready? Okay, I started recording, so we can start now. This
I'm going
is
to mute
the
everybody.
second, excuse me, this is the second Zoom session in our second unit. Our second unit is Rabbis and Noahides. Essentially, what we're trying to do in this unit is we're going to build up and give the information for Noahides to be able to make intelligent decisions about who's a rabbi that you should listen to and who's not. With everything on the internet, which is where most of the information comes, it's obvious that it's very difficult to know who to listen to. I mean, I know from Judaism itself, a lot of people on what they talk about Judaism on the internet is like more than 50% of it you should ignore because it's not true, or it's missing out some things. So for Noahides, it's even more difficult because your background is you're coming to something that you don't really know, how it relates. It's like a change of life, change of the paradigm, as we've been always talking about the term paradigm being very important to understand. So what we're going to do is we're trying to get to. Now, last week, what we did is we discussed the issue of rabbinic authority, the source of it, talked about it in the Torah, excuse me, and then we discussed the extension of it and how the rabbis have, what the authority that rabbis have. But that sort of leaves you. What does that have to do with that and what we see today? We talked a little bit about it. But now for this session and possibly the next couple of sessions, we're going to do something which is going to be somewhat more interesting. And well, for me, it's somewhat interesting. For you, it may not be as much, but it's going to be something you don't know about. We're going to trace the history of the authority in Judaism all the way up to our present day. And then after we do that, I'm going to give another talk, complete for itself, in order to understand the difference in Hasidim and the yeshivas, which are most of the people who are involved in reaching out to Noahides, either are Hasidic or they are from more what we call the yeshivas or the non-Hasidic world. So these are different, and I want to give an idea for that whole session just discussing about that, even though some of the names may come up earlier. I want to discuss that so that you can know who you're talking. Like, for example, I look different Saturday night. It's after Shabbos, so I still haven't changed my clothes after Shabbos. I look certainly much different than, so for example, from the Hasidic world, if you knew about Chabad, for example, they wear bend-down hats, they wear different things. And the yeshivish will dress up. Yes, there's a lot of different things. Okay, so what I'm trying to do is, in this part, which is going to take a couple of sessions, is to bring you from the theoretical concept of what rabbinic authority is, and bring it down today to see how it actually works in the world, in order that you as Noahides will have a bit of understanding what it is. Okay, where somebody's coming from, what, and the differences. I have not seen any people from the Sephardic world who are involved with Noahides directly. So for that reason, I'm not going to talk about them much. They'll come up, in somewhat, but not as much in depth as the way we'll do with the Hasidim and the Yeshivish world, because those are very important. And they have some very significant effects as far as Noahides, as far as legal things are concerned. And we'll discuss some of that stuff. Some of that stuff's going to come up. Okay, so let's discuss a little bit more. What we're trying to do here, again, is we're trying to take it from the theory that we were talking about, which is the way we practice, of course, so it's not theory in the sense of just, but bring it into line so that those people here, the Noahides, will understand how that really works in real life now today. So we're going to trace actually how things got from the beginning to the end. And this is on itself is very important because Judaism rises or falls based on the tradition. And truth of the matter is, most Noahides don't really know how we got from there to here. Most Jews who are raised religious know the names from generation to generation. They have the basic ideas. They know our ancestors were here, where they went, and how it developed. But Noahides don't see where it is. And so it's a certain disadvantage when you're trying to speak with rabbis, not knowing where it's coming in, it's just going to help you. So we're going to do this again, as I said, in two parts. The first part is we're going to deal with the general tradition as it goes from generation to generation. We're going to see where generational breaks come up and how that works. And then we're going to do, of course, the Chassidim and Yeshivish world separately. That'll be one of its own completely. Now, one of the things also we're going to be doing here, which is something which you may not have a familiarity, is showing there are certain breaks, and many of the breaks and where the things split off in Judaism are based actually on things in the secular world. What happened? Okay. For example, how did the Jews get to Poland? Most of the Jews came from Poland and Russia, or Poland, Russia, which is Eastern Europe. How did they get to there? We know that the Jews were exiled into Roman lands, which means they came to Gaul, which was France and Germany. Okay, so that's where they went when they were exiled from after the war with Hadrian. We'll get to that in shortly. They went to Italy, and then they went eventually to Germany, what would later be called Germany. They called it Gaul at that time. So how did they get from there to Poland? How did they get to Poland? What are the things going? So as a backdrop for where different rabbis end up in different places, we're going to give a little bit of history. It's not going to be totally history. It's not going to be just enough so you get a feel of what was actually going on during all these periods of time. Okay, so let's start off now. In the beginning of Pirkei Avos, it traces the tradition, the Messiah, from the beginning until the beginning. It actually goes through many of the rabbis, but we're just going to do the one mission that says it. First, it starts off saying that Moses received the Torah on Mount Sinai. We all know from the Torah that's in the book of Exodus, chapter 19, 20. We see the events there. These are not new. Then the Torah was handed down from Moshe. He gave it to Yehoshua. This occurred right before the Jewish people entered the land, fulfilling the promise that was given to Avram, that the land would be given to him. Then Yeshua, when he died, we give it to the Zakainim, the elders, which it says at the end of the book of Joshua. Then the elders gave it over to the prophets, which came later on, starting around the time of King David. There were prophets, and the prophets gave it to the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. Anshe Knesset Gedolah is that group of people, of the Jewish leaders who lived in the Babylonian exile. And they came together and they did a number of things that are very important to understand. Before that time, for example, there was no Tanakh. There's no Bible. There were different books. The Torah was one book of 5 books together, and the book of Joshua, Yeshua. These books existed, okay, but they weren't. It wasn't the concept of a Bible. Isaiah lived a couple hundred years after the story when King David, 100 something. A little weak on the chronology at the moment, but he lived a certain amount of time after David, and certain much more lived 500 or so years after Moshe. So there wasn't a full book at the one time. These got together. Well, who did it? This was actually done by the Anshe Knesset Gedolah. That's the name we give them. Anshe Knesset Gedolah, basically, the translation is the men of the Great Assembly. And they came together, and there were some prophets. Malachi was there, Haggai was there. They were in the Babylonian exile, and they came. Those are the ones who gave us the books, which essentially became our Tanakh. After that, as we know in the Tanakh, we know from Ezra and Nehemiah that the Jewish people did return to the land, and they built a second temple under Ezra and Nehemiah, and there they settled. And there we have the tradition from there on, which are basically, they're not exactly what we say the rabbis, but they're like sort of pre the rabbis. So we have the first one was Shimon HaTzadik, was also the high priest at the same time. He was the first generation, and he's very important. He comes up every once in a while, but he was the one. The story is told about when Alexander the Great came to the Holy Land, and he came there, and he was met by a delegation of Jewish people from Jerusalem, and that was Shimon HaTzadik. That's what the story is. And then it continues, and this is again, Pirkei Avos brings this also, and all the sources bring it, that after that were a group of people leading up to those rabbis that you'd be more familiar with, like Hillel. So it was Shimon, Antigonus Ish Sarfat, and Pirkei Avos brings teaching from these people. Yossi ben Yochanan was the next generation with Yossi ben Yozer. They were the same connection. The next generation was Yeshua ben Parachi and Natai Haraboli. Now they were very important because they lived in the time of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, and Yeshua ben Parachi is one of the significant figures of there. And here is where we can actually begin with a tracing historically, because we also have not just a traditionally handed down orally, but we actually have records of this. So, for example, at that time, which is, we're talking about the 2nd century BCE, we have a statement from Josephus talking about in that generation. And here he's talking about the time when, until that time, everybody was essentially a Pharisee. What happened is the king Jonathan, excuse me. One second, let me go get it again. I don't want to get this mistaken here. I believe, yeah, his name was Hyrcanus. He took at that time, many people had taken Greek names also. So at the time, everybody was a Pharisee. This is something that people don't know. Everybody at the time, the 2nd century BCE, were all Pharisees. Okay. Now, Josephus brings from that time when the Pharisees were in charge, that time, this is what he's saying. And this is in the 13th book, chapter 10, paragraph 6 is actually what it is in my editions. We can find about there. It says this. What I would now explain is this, that the Pharisees delivered to the people a great many observances by succession from their fathers, which are not written in the laws of Moses. This is what we know now as these traditions were what handed down. This is what the rabbis have. So we know from the 2nd century BCE that the Pharisees, who will see the Pharisees and the rabbis are essentially a different name for the same group, they already at that time were known to have traditions that were passed down that were not written in the Torah. Now, this was not just a small sect. What Josephus says after talking about them, it says, there it's talking about the difference between Sadducees. It says this, while the Sadducees are able to pay none but the rich and have not the populace obsequious, means I guess supporting to them, but the Pharisees have the multiple on their side. Okay, so what's he saying here? And this is very important to understand our tradition. Already by the 2nd century BCE, the people were always following the Pharisees. They had their traditions that go back. Just like we talk about today, our traditions would go back, but they had their traditions that go back. And in fact, their traditions go back a smaller amount of time than ours do. Our traditions go back over, we're talking 2,000 years. Their traditions go back not even anywhere near that much. But these are traditions handed down from generation to generation. It is what we call our oral law, which is oral traditions and stuff like that. So, but the point is this oral law, this oral tradition, and we see that the Pharisees were those who the people follow. And that's very important to understand that the Pharisees were the people really followed them. In another book of Josephus, in book 18, chapter 1-3, talking about the Pharisees, it talks a little bit about what some of the beliefs are, and these beliefs are clearly beliefs that the rabbis believe. they are able to persuade the body of the people, and whatsoever they do about divine worship, prayers, and sacrifices, they perform them according to their direction, insomuch that the cities give great attestation to them on account of their entire virtuous conduct, both in the actions of their lives and their discourses also. So what's it saying? The Pharisees were beloved by everybody because of the nature of their life, because of their knowledge, because of their teachings. The Pharisees, which is what the Rabbinic Judaism becomes later on, the name that we give to later on, but at that time it's called the Pharisees, as it had been called for generations before. The Pharisees were essentially the rabbinic authority of the time. The split between the Pharisees only started in the 2nd century BCE. Until that time, there were no groups. The Balaam with the Sadducees, it seems, is another issue. We might talk about that sometime, but it's not so much relevant as far as the problem is concerned. What it's important to understand is the rabbis, Pharisees, rabbis, were essentially Judaism. So, if you're familiar with what the New Testament, you see invariably who is Jesus talking to? He's only talking to the Pharisees. Why? Because that's Judaism. To say being a Pharisee, follow the Pharisees, and being Jewish is essentially the same thing. The people were Pharisees, as far as that's concerned. Okay? That's why Paul says that he was the greatest of the Pharisees, which there's a lot of reasons to doubt that, but that's not really our discussion here. The point is that we see the discussions there, whether it's a New Testament, everybody agrees the Pharisees was Judaism. Everybody. Okay, even the Christians agree the Pharisees were Judaism. There were other groups. We can talk about what they were, but the Sadducees, as Josephus said, nobody followed them. They were a rich person's religion. They were very assimilationist, and they were not very religious as it was. And the Essenes is a different story. I've done studies on that, and my counter-missionary stuff I talk about. The Essenes actually followed principles very similar to the rabbis, the Pharisees, but they differed. Okay, and if we know from the Talmud that rabbis didn't differ. The Essenes were like a group for themselves, but it's very hard to say that they were anti-Pharisee in the sense that they didn't accept Pharisees as being Jewish. They just disagreed with them about different things. So that was in the time Yeshiva and Parachia, when we see clearly, and Josephus talks about it from both then and until later on, that the Pharisees were in essence Judaism, and that the people followed them. That was Judaism. Okay. In the next generation, we see Yehuda ben Tabai and Shimon ben Shetach. Shimon ben Shetach is very important. Some other figures around the time of Talion and Shemaiah. And Choni Amaga was a miracle worker at that time. Very well-known stories for him performing miracles in the Talmud. And that was essentially the time of Hanukkah. Hanukkah occurred in the time of Shimon ben Shetach, where, again, many people don't understand Hanukkah. Hanukkah was not a fought over nationalistic type ideas. It wasn't a question of becoming independent from the Greek Empire that was there. The fight was about being able to follow the Jewish religion. We never find that the Jews revolted against Rome or anybody else if it wasn't based on religious reasons. Okay? Well, the revolt that led to the destruction of the Second Temple was because of religious persecution. And the next revolt that happened at the time of Rabbi Akiva, about Hadrian, was again because of prohibitions of circumcision and religious persecution. That was the only times that we'll see that the Jewish people in Talmud and ancient times actually revolted. Otherwise, they didn't revolt. Even though they were oppressed, as long as the religious observances, again, that means religious, following what the Pharisees taught, as long as they were not hindered with, then there was no problem. It didn't make a difference, the political part, but was important, the religious part. Important to understand. So the Hanukkah, what happened in Hanukkah was basically the Jewish people were being persecuted, not being able to keep the laws of the Torah, the things in the temple. The temple was desecrated. That led to the actual revolt. Okay, so after the generation after that is Hillel and Shammai. Hillel actually came from Babylonia to Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. and that's where he was. Now, the next generation is essentially the last generation before the destruction of the temple. Okay, so right now we followed our history almost to the destruction of the temple. The last person I want to mention of importance here is Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel was the grandson, I believe, of Hillel, not his son, but his grandson. And Rabban Gamliel died around 48 in the Common Era. Hillel died somewhere around 8 in the Common Era, and Rabban Gamliel died around 48 in the Common Era. Now, there was another person of very importance, of course, we know within them. That was Yonasan ben Azil. Yonasan ben Azil was a translator, the Targum Yonasan, a very important translator on Nach specifically, was done by him. Now, this Rabban Gamliel is very important for a number of reasons. We do not have outside historical evidence about many people, which of course would be common. However, we have two sources for Gamliel outside of the Talmudic Jewish tradition. The one of them you should be familiar with is in the New Testament. Paul claims to have been a student of Gamliel, which historically it works out. If Gamliel died in 48 and Paul lived about that time, so Gamliel was, of course, the biggest rabbi at the time. So, the name is true. Whether it's true that he actually learned from him, there's a lot of questions about that. Paul was not above fudging about historical facts, pumping himself up. But what it is important is that Gamliel was important enough for Paul to say that he was a student of his. And the Pharisees were important enough that they were Judaism, that the New Testament talks primarily about them. And Paul specifically says that he was a Pharisee in order to bring up his credentials as being somebody who was really Jewish. Okay? I don't want to get into my counter-missionary stuff here, but I want to just understand that when we're talking about real historical events here. Okay? We're trying to show that this actual historical, going down is real events, real things that happen, and these people are pretty well known. So now we've come up to the generation of the destruction of the temple, and I would just like to mention a few things. Now, I left out, I made a mistake. I left out, actually, we also know about Philo. Philo lived in Alexandria, and he died somewhere around the time of Gamliel, maybe a little bit earlier than him. He died in Alexandria. He was a representative of what we call Alexandrian Judaism, and interesting enough, he brings things in the name of the people who are knowledgeable. Now, one of the things he brings in his book is talking about why was Adam created after the world was after all the other animals. He says it's talking about the reason why is because that he should come to have everything prepared for him. Now, there's similar midrashim, and I remember that I couldn't find it before this, but there is a midrash somewhere that says the same thing from the rabbis. So we see that Philo actually had similar knowledge, and if you read through Philo, you find a lot of things there, which shows that he was also a Pharisee. Now, he was different, and that's sort of outside of the topic here, because just as we'll see that Judaism today has different groups under the banner, under the tent, that we might say, of Orthodox Judaism, at that time being a Pharisee did not mean that everybody followed. We see that even in the Talmud. In the Talmud, we find rabbis, all Pharisees themselves, all rabbis, where they disagree about different things. Disagreement doesn't make you out. It's, again, this is the paradigm in Judaism is not the paradigm, from Christianity. The paradigm in Judaism is that disagreement is fine. You're supposed to be respectful. When a decision is made, you have to follow the decision. But disagreements on how things should be done is is understandable, and it's part of what happens. Okay. Again, that's not the paradigm you see in Christianity, where if you disagree with somebody, you're going to hell. Okay, and that's true. If you know Christian tradition, that's always been that way. Okay, so let me just cover the generation of the destruction, because that does lead to a change in the Jewish people and their way of life. At the time of the destruction, there were a number of very important rabbis. The leader of the generation was Shimon, the son of Gamliel, who we mentioned before. Okay, now he was murdered. He was executed during the rebellion. But what's important about him is that he is an historical figure that we know about. He's mentioned in Josephus. Josephus has a book, his autobiography, which is very interesting. Reading, it talks about his way, his life as far as, um, what he did during the war, basically, since he was a general in the Galilee. But to see what he says. You're talking about people going to Jerusalem to speak to the leader there, and says, who do they speak it to? Simon, the son of Gamliel, Shimon Gamliel, in order to persuade him to induce the communality of Jerusalem to take me. There would be somebody was sent to him, having been being taken away from his job there. Okay, but what we see here is Shimon ben Gamliel is actually the leader. Now he says who this was. This Simon was of the city of Jerusalem and of a very noble family of the sect of the Pharisees. Noble family. He's descended direct of Hillel, which is probably the most noble family in the Holy Land at the time, which was supposed to excel others in the accurate knowledge of the laws of their country. Again, his description of Shimon ben Gamliel, remember he was writing this for non-Jews, his description of Shimon ben Gamliel exactly corresponds to what we know about him. He was a leader. He was most knowledgeable of the time. He was a leader of the Jewish people in that period of time. Now, among the other people that at that time, I'll just mention a couple of them because you may have heard of them. One is Yochanan ben Zakkai. He lived before the destruction. He lived during the destruction in Jerusalem. His students actually took him out of Jerusalem. Talmud tells a story about that. And it was him who set up in Yavne the rabbis. He gathered together all the rabbis. And after destruction, he was the one who helped to make Judaism to exist after that. Another one was a famous Rabbi Hanina ben Dosa, who lived at the same time as Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he was known as a miracle worker. There are a number of miracle workers are known throughout history in the Jewish people. In the Talmud, there's many of them mentioned. I mentioned Hanina Amago, but Hanina ben Dosa is another one. Okay, let me just take a breath of air because we're going to talk about the rabbis after the destruction of the temple, and specifically, we're going to talk about the Mishnah. Because while some of the rabbis we mentioned until now do make it into the Mishnah, especially Pirkei Avos, sometimes in other places, they don't make it as much into the Mishnah. But rabbis of generations afterwards do make it into Mishnah, and they're very important for the continuation of the tradition. So we have the tradition going down from Moshe all the way to Babylonian exile. After the Babylonian exile, they come back, and the first person is Shimon HaTzadik. And after that, we have generation after generation, one after another, we know, certain events happening that I mentioned, leading to Hillel. After Hillel, again, a couple of generations, his grandson, Gamliel, his grandson, Shimon ben Gamliel, and continuing. That is the tradition. We're taking all the way down to the destruction of the temple. I'm going to take a break for a couple of minutes, ask some questions. And from the destruction of the temple, we're going to take it on another few periods of time. So I will open it up for any questions. Anybody have any questions? Questions, comments? It's more history, not much about Noahide law, but the effect of this is very important because you have to know where the Noahide laws that come into the Talmud are based on the tradition, which basically goes back to Moshe. That's part of our tradition. Okay, the rabbis have authority, but there's also a tradition that goes down with it. Ronald, anybody? Anybody up? Anybody sleep? Okay, Dan?
No, I'm good, Rabbi. I thoroughly enjoy the history. I've been reading a wonderful book on my Rocky Mountain readings, and it really filled in the gap, especially from that 200 to the time the Romans made their appearance. I found the one chapter was on a Jewish queen from around was around 70 BC.
Yeah.
They used the phrase her name Shlomtzion.
Oh, Shamsia, that
Uh,
was Shimon Shetach's sister.
right, right, and she had been around, but how she endorsed she plainly endorsed the Pharisees as well, and
She was.
yeah,
I didn't want to, it's like this. I didn't want to do too much history because the real purpose is the tradition. But it's impossible to understand Jewish history, even rabbinic history, if you don't have a little bit of historical knowledge. Things that, Jews take for granted, the Hanukkah story, you know, things that we take for granted. Um, uh, I mean, I did mention when the Romans actually started taking control around the late third century, second century, I think it was, BCE, when they started going because of after the Hanukkah story, there was like fights among the two brothers, and they asked Rome to take
yes,
it, and that's how Rome got control. So these are not important. They're interesting historically, but they're not important as far as our rabbinic tradition is concerned. It does
right,
not, it doesn't have. It's just things that are going on. The destruction of the temple is extremely important because that led, whereas the center was worship in the temple and the main centers of base courts were in Jerusalem. With the destruction of the first temple, second temple, that caused a change. Much like with the destruction of the first temple, caused the Jewish people to go into exile and changed many things. We got the Tanakh because of that. Okay, otherwise they didn't need it. And so the same thing happens with the destruction. Things change. Not as serious as they're going to change later on, we're going to find, but it does change significantly in that Jerusalem is no longer the center. Other areas which had rabbis now become the center. Okay, and that leads to what's going to happen in the future. Essentially, the which culminates in the Mishnah. Um, Now, the being said after the first temple, the second temple, Jews did live in Jerusalem. They didn't. That only happened. That stopped later on. We'll talk about that. But the center, the structure was so great that they had to basically relocate, and they never really relocated back to Jerusalem. They always stayed in different places. The Talmud talked about going from one place to another, which is not essentially to understand, but essentially once the temple was destroyed, it comes to the end of a certain era. The Jewish people's center of Jewish authority was no longer in
the
Jerusalem, but it
Commonwealth was gone,
yeah
yeah,
it went to different places, to Yavna, to various different places. There were rabbinic courts and set up, but still not the same as when it was in Jerusalem. And we're going to find that when historical events change in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, we're going to find how that actually affected um, where the Jewish centers of learning are going to be. Okay, right now at this time, while there are people learning still in Babylonia, the center of Jewish learning was actually in Israel. That's why the
Yavne,
Mishnah. That's why the Mishnah will quote only rabbis from Israel. Okay. Well, by the time we get to the Talmud, we're going to find that we're getting rabbis from Babylonia. We're going to see how that changes and why it changes. We'll discuss that. That's what our next part is going to talk about, the Mishnah, and then we'll
right,
move to. Okay.
after Rabbi Akiva, right? There's a bit of big bottleneck there.
No, but let me be the teacher here. Okay.
Okay,
It's a little bit more complicated, and these things are very important because it has to do with Judaism in certain ways of rabbinic authority. You're going to see what's going on, and some things are important. Okay, so let's continue. Unless there's another question, I will continue with from the destruction of the temple until the Mishnah. We're going to start getting into things that you do not know about, you've never heard about, but are again important. The Mishnahs are extremely important. Okay, so let's go now. Okay, in the Mishnah. Now, the first generation after the destruction we find a number of important rabbis who come up in the Talmud all the time, in the Mishnah all the time, and are very important. So again, I could spend hours on this, so I'm going to just go to each generation, just mention just shortly a little bit of those rabbis who are important that you might hear of in other places. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who lived after the destruction, but he didn't live very long. After him, leading was two rabbis, Rabbi Gamliel, who was Rabbi Shimon's son, and Elazar ben Azariah. The Gemara brings a whole discussion about it. They ended up both leading at the same time. But there are also other rabbis important, Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshia, and Rabbi Tarfon are names that come up all the time in the Talmud also, and also in the Mishnah. Okay, that's a second. The next generation is one that you might be a little bit more familiar with. That's a generation of Rabbi Akiva. This goes into basically the early part of the 2nd century with a common era. Okay. Now, the important event of that time was, of course, the Bar Kokhba revolt. Okay. What happened is under King Hadrian, the Roman Empire, he forbade in Jerusalem, in the Holy Land, the Jews to keep certain things. And that led to a revolt. The revolt was so serious that, in fact, I mean, these are events that even the Romans have in Roman story had. It was so serious that he had to call numerous legions to go there. And, when he would go to the Senate to say what's going on, he would always say, everything's good in the empire. That year, during the revolt, he didn't say it because the revolt was that serious. And unfortunately, it didn't last long. As we know, that Rabbi Akiva was one of the people who was executed during that. Among another, Rabbi Shmuel was executed. Another figure from that time is, of course, very well known, Onkelos, who was a convert, who was a ger, who is a primary translator into Aramaic of the Torah. He lived at that time. That's when he wrote his translation. Okay, so that's the period we're talking about. Now, Rabbi Akiva is very important for many reasons. One of them is he is actually, when the Mishnah comes down, remember, there's a number of different rabbis, but they all have their teachers. When Rabbi Huda Hanassi, well, we're going to get to him, his compilation basically goes back to Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim. It goes basically back to him. So when we have the Mishnah basically goes back to teachings that come from Rabbi Akiva. Okay, very important. It's mentioned many times in the Talmud about what it is. Okay, so the next generation after Rabbi Akiva is Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who was the leader. Again, we have the leader who was of the family of Hillel. However, at that time, there were a number of very important rabbis that come up. Rabbi Meir is one of the biggest ones. Rabbi Meir was the biggest Talmud of Rabbi Akiva, and in fact, he was a teacher of the next generation, Yehuda Hanassi. And again, the Mishnah tradition goes through Rabbi Meir from Rabbi Akiva. Okay, but also the very other important rabbis, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yasser, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai is very important because we trace the mystical traditions that come in the Zohar back to Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. Okay, so these names come in. So he lived in the generation after Rabbi Akiva, being from Rabbi Akiva's Talmidim. Okay, and from Rabbi Meir, and they're from that generation. Okay, and that's again, we're leading now very close to the Talmud because to the Mishnah and of course the Talmud because many of the arguments in the Talmud are Rabbi Shimon against Rabbi Eliezer or Rabbi Meir, or we're dealing with rabbis who are not just in the Mishnah, but whose teachings are the subject of discussions that we're going to find in the Talmud. Again, we see this tradition, how it goes, and it all comes from one generation. The Talmud is going to be trying to, when we get to that, we see Talmud is trying to clarify views where we see things that might be contradictory to know how we're supposed to act. Whereas the Mishnah just gives views and doesn't. An important thing about the Mishnah, which we're going to get to in a minute, let's go to the next generation. So the generation after Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Meir, we find the next generation is going to be Rabbi Huda Hanassi. Rabbi Huda Hanassi is how I would say it. And he was one who compiled the Mishnah, but in time was also Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Pinchas ben Yoel was also a very important person at that time. And in that time, the Mishnah was compiled. We're talking about the end of the 2nd century CE. I think Rabbi Huda died somewhere around 180, something like that. Okay. Now, historically, what's going on in the outside world is starting to have an effect. I'll put something up here a second. Okay. In the Roman world, certain things were going on. So the Gemara talks about how Rabbi Yehuda was very close with the Roman emperor. Marcus Aurelius, called Marcus Aurelius. I think he was not the Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher, but his father who adopted him. Okay, and at that time things were very, very settled. So there was a possibility. Rabbi understood that there would be a possibility that these teachings could be lost. They were handed down orally. Some people might have made notes, but essentially it was orally. But they didn't have it compiled. The authoritative views were not compiled in one place. So Rebbe saw at that time there was a time of peace. I mean, until before then, for the last 2 centuries, there's been constant, turmoil, with the revolt and everything. That was a time of peace. That was a time that they could now compile the Mishnah into one place and have the laws in one place, have something like that, so that it would be easier for later generations to be able to, um, follow and understand how they're supposed to act. Okay, and the rabbis who are in the Mishnah, or considered the Mishnaic period, are called Tanoim. From the word Tana means to teach. Okay, they were our teachers. The Mishnah is the teachings that are handed down to us. There's a compilation of teachings the rabbis taught, basically from the tradition. If Rabbi Akiva says such and such, that doesn't mean that he was the one who was inventing it. He had it from the tradition. He was a teacher who we got it from him, even though it came from before then. So Rabbi Yehuda Nussi, he was the one who put these things all together and made the Mishnah at the end of the 2nd century. There was one more generation before actually the time of the rabbis. That was Rabbi Gamliel ben Rabbi Yehuda's son, and Mishir ben Levi. But essentially, we're coming to the end of an era. And this is a significant end of an era, because the Tanaim, who are in the Mishnah, and those who come later, which we call the Amoraim, mean people who say, is from the Talmud, they are completely, it's very different. The changes were significant. And among the reasons remember, I just said beforehand that Rebbe lived in a time when it was fairly stable. Okay. But that didn't last very long, because once after Marcus Aurelius died, which was we're talking about the end of the 2nd century, which is of course where the Mishnah was, the Roman emperors was basically from then on into chaos. Okay. I'm just looking it up now because I want to remind myself of this history. Afterwards, after Marcus Aurelius, he had his son Commodius made emperor, who was a horrible emperor, and he was assassinated. And following that, what came the period of time, I'm just reading this up here, the year of the 5 emperors. They had one period of time, they had 5 emperors in the year 193. Then they had a dynasty that lasted 40 years. And from then on, there was the 200s. They call it, referred to as a crisis of the 3rd century. In that time, we see a number of things happening. One of them is, since the Holy Land was under the Romans and Babylonia was under the Persians, and Babylonia, the situation of the Jewish people is settled. In the Holy Land, it wasn't. So we're going to see many rabbis moving from the Holy Land to Babylonia, and Babylonia, the center of Torah learning, moves to Babylonia in the 3rd century. So let's just stop a second here before we start into that, talking about the rabbis of the Talmud, and just open up for some questions, comments, anything like that. I see Janice, you're writing diligently down. There's no test at the end of this. Don't worry about it. I'm not going to be tested on. You don't have to remember the names. You just go to Wiki to Wiki and on Google. You'll find all the names and most of the stuff. It's findable. So the important thing is to understand that what we're talking about is there a clear tradition from generation to generation, people who taught the next generation. Now, at the end of Mishnah, time for the Mishnah, when the Mishnah was written down, the reason why we want to stop here because we want to emphasize a certain point. Historical events changed fundamentally the centers of learning and just the quality of our knowledge. The rabbis in the Talmud, we're going to talk about, will be much different than rabbis in the Mishnah. Ronald, you want to ask a question?
Onkelos translated into Aramaic. Is there any reason for that, or is that just the language he learned as opposed to Hebrew?
Because that's what people spoke.
Right.
There's a very interesting story in the 11th century. We're going to get to this person's name anyway. It's very important. A rabbi wrote a book called the Aruch. Something that set out, basically translating Talmudic terms that are in Aramaic into Hebrew. And he said the reason why he did it is because people weren't speaking Aramaic anymore, and they couldn't understand what the Talmud was saying. In some places, the words that they would know because it wasn't their common speech. The common speech was Aramaic. And in Babylonian, it was specifically Babylonian Aramaic, and the Aramaic spoken in Jerusalem is different. We're going to get to the Jerusalem Talmud soon, but the Jerusalem Talmud is Aramaic, but it's a different flavor of Aramaic from that in there. Of course, it's all Greek to you guys. I understand that, but if you're looking at both of them, you can see the differences. The Talmud from the Babylonian Talmud, which is what we learn mostly, it came later, and we'll discuss a little bit of that shortly. But it's less pure Aramaic. It has a lot more Hebrew in it, and it's a different style of Aramaic. The spellings are slightly different because of pronunciations.
Question in the chat box.
Yeah, I'm going to go look at that question too before I went. We actually, very interesting question. Caleb asks, do we find any books talking about social life? There's none specifically, but the Talmud talks many times about what people did and how they lived. We have a lot of, because remember, telling you what the Talmud is, we're going to get into it, but the Talmud is basically discussions of, Jewish law, and it deals with Jewish life, what people do, how people actually do things. And so you do get an idea of social life there. It's something that yes, you do see that. You see it in the Talmud, but there's no books written specifically like that I know of. Maybe some scholars have done something like that, but I don't really trust scholars very much because they're coming in with their own paradigm of what things are. And if you see, compared to what I've been telling you now and what they say, my just has come from my, biases of being an Orthodox Jew, because Josephus says the same thing also. Okay, the Pharisees were Judaism in the Second Temple period. Okay, and so that just was the way it was. So, and the scholars have their own, things, whatever, but they don't seem to look at the Jewish paradigm. That's why the Jewish paradigm is very important. Okay, again, but we don't get that much of it. And I said, so right now we've gone up to the Mishnah. Everything with the Mishnah is different than what's going to happen from the Talmud. Okay, Ronald, do you want to ask a question, or otherwise I'll go on? Ronald, you were going to ask something?
No, I was just listening.
Okay, so now before we start naming the names, we're going to discuss a very important principle. In the Talmud, there's a very important principle. And in order to do this, let me just mention the rabbis in the first generation of the Talmud rabbis, what's called Amoraim, which means the people who are speakers. These names are very important. In Babylonia, here we first find the first generations. We have people in Babylonia and in Israel. Some of these people learned in Israel and went there, but we see difference. So in Babylonia, the two biggest names there are Rav and Shmuel. Okay, in Israel, it's Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish is a very interesting story. Reish Lakish, in his younger years, had been a robber. Rabbi Yochanan met up with him, and he left his ways. He repented, and he was actually the number one student of Rabbi Yochanan. Now, I would like to, Rav and Shmuel are also very in the Talmud. They're like the biggest ones, but I'd like to concentrate on Rav because there's something about Rav which is very important. The Talmud says, although he was an Amora, he came in the third Bid'ah, the Talmud says about him, it says Rav Tana Ipaleg. Rav is to be considered as a Tana, same stature rabbi as the Mishnah, and he has the authority to disagree. So what's that mean here? Rabbis in the Talmud do not have any more that authority to argue with rabbis of the Mishnah. So the discussions in the Talmud are not what a rabbi in the Mishnah thinks it should be. The discussions in Talmud owes a rabbi from the Talmud and Gemara will bring a rabbi from the Mishnah or from the time of the Mishnah said X. Another rabbi said Y. They either discuss whether they actually disagree or whether you can make some kind of agreement among them, or if you have to choose one or the other. Rav was different. Rav was like a Tana. He could say something on his own authority. That's what I said, Rav Tana. Rav could say on authority because the generation just changed then. If you're in the rabbis in Talmud cannot argue with a rabbi from Mishnah. All they could do is say, yes, this rabbi says this, but this is what this rabbi says, and this one's the one that we follow. Okay, it's very important. It may seem to you a very small thing, but it's extremely important to understand because it's fundamental to understanding the halachic, how we deal with halacha today, because we recognize this different. So somebody from the Mishnah, they have a certain authority of their words because they're closer to the tradition and it's a repeating tradition. Somebody in Amora from the Talmud, he cannot disagree with it. He could only say, yes, this was his view, but this too, the rabbi disagreed, and that's the view that everybody followed. And so we see the more is going to, you have these intense discussions, and many times at the end it'll say, well, we follow the law follows this certain person. That's what we follow. You'll actually find in the Talmud, interestingly enough, that they could spend pages and pages on a particular view of somebody whose view, as far as the law is concerned, is rejected. Okay, we're going to discuss about this more when we talk about Jewish learning, different types of Jewish learning, to understand how people see things differently. But that's the way the Talmud is like. It discusses different views of Tana, what they say, and eventually they try and come to a conclusion. So again, the first generation. Again, some of these names you might have heard, but I'm sure most of them you haven't. But it's very important to understand. So we have Rav and Shmuel in Babylonia and Rabbi Yochanan and Eretz Yisrael. What's very important is with Rav, we have the start of something that for the next, from the 3rd century to the 11th century, is extremely important. Rav started the yeshiva in Babylonia, the first yeshiva in Babylonia. Very important. He started in the city of Sur. And that's the famous yeshiva called the Yeshiva Sur. Now, there were other yeshivas that were there. One was in the city of Nahardua. It was probably founded somewhere. I wasn't able to find out when that was. But Rav founded his yeshiva, I'd say, in the early 3rd century, maybe 210s, 220s. I couldn't find the exact date for that. So the next generation after them is in Babylonia, Rav Chizda and Rav Shmuel ben Nachmani. These are very important rabbis in the Talmud. They come up all the time, but Chizda is almost on almost every page. Rav Chizda comes up in almost page in Talmud. I mean, I was learning on Shabbos, Gemara. Rav Chizda came up a few times. Okay, he was the leader of the generation from his generation. That's where the generation comes. The next generation, again, we see the first one in Babylonia was Rabbah. The second one is Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera is very interesting because he lived in Israel, but he went to Babylonia, and Rabbi Avia was in Israel also. Rabbi Avia, yeah. Now, during this period of time, a couple of things happened. We're talking about the 250s. One was in Babylonia. The second yeshiva, the second most important yeshiva, Pumbedisa, was founded. So we have these two. We had 3 yeshivas. Let me just figure it. But right after the yeshiva Pumbedisa was founded, the yeshiva in Hadua was destroyed. Now, this time, again, was a time of very, serious problems in Israel. So we see that things are going down and down. So Nehardua was destroyed in 259, but the Shiva Pumbedisa was founded in 257. So at that time, again, in the middle, we have two main yeshivas. And if you remember just one thing from here, it's very important. Remember the Yeshiva of Surah and the Shiva Pumbedisa, because these were the main sources of Torah for the Jewish people until basically the 11th century. So from the 3rd to 11th century, there's two yeshivas that were there, and the trials and everything that went on. Those two yeshivas there were the main places where the tradition was being handed down from generation to generation. We actually had yeshivas where we would have, from generation to generation, people would be handing it down until the 11th century. And we'll talk about what happens in the 11th century. So I'm going to try to get up to the 11th century today, and then we'll follow after the 11th century after that. So again, this was central authority for Torah tradition in Babylonia on the two yeshivas. Now, the next generation sees two rabbis which are extremely important, Abaya and Rava. Okay, discussions of the Talmud are usually called to the discussions of Abaya and Rava because they are the main people who are discussing things together. This is actually building to bring together the Talmud itself. Okay, Abaya and Rava were in Babylonia. There was still a community that existed in Israel, but again, because of all the turmoil in the Roman Empire, because of it was on a very serious decline, and the actual total decline will come about when the Roman Empire becomes Christian and the great persecutions start. Okay. Now, the next generation, the generation of Ayaruva, is in Babylonia. Babylonia, we have rabbis like Rav Kahana. Rav Puvit of Kahana is very well known because there are midrashic collections that trace back to him. But what's important is, at this time, we get to two important events historically. Number one, since Abaya and Rava at that time, in Israel, they've been collecting the discussions that became from the rabbis of Meroim, and in the year somewhere in the 300s, around 350 maybe, the Yerushalmi Talmud was finished. Yerushalmi Talmud was finished. Okay, now for reasons, the Yerushalmi Talmud is not as authoritative as the Babylonian one. Of course, the Babylonian has things that the Yerushalmi doesn't have, but much more authoritative. And the yeshivas were in Surah and Pumbedisa in Babylonia. But the Yerushalmi was finished. The reason why is for the similar reasons for why the Mishnah was finished. Because of the turmoil that was going on in the Roman Empire, and because of what's going on, it was understood that these discussions that the rabbis in Israel had. Now, the rabbis in the Yerushalmi are only rabbis from Israel. They don't have any from Babylonia, whereas in Babylonia they have from both. So these rabbis who were arguing, there was the fear that these discussions of halacha, of the Jewish law, what things would be lost. Because of that, they wrote down the Talmud. And secondly, there was another thing. And this, of course, is important today, but I have to explain what it is. In order to, as everybody knows, the Jewish calendar is basically a lunar calendar. When it gets to the beginning of the lunar month, that's where it stops. Okay, it's a lunar calendar. But in order to have a lunar calendar, you have to have somebody who has the authority to say, okay, I say the month is starting now. Now, we see from the Mishnah, the time of the Mishnah, this was done by the courts in Jerusalem. Okay. Now, when Jerusalem was destroyed, they went to different cities, but still it was always the authority of those who were the leaders of the Jewish people in Israel, the Holy Land, had the authority to do it. If you were outside, you did not have the authority to do it. So with all the turmoil going down there in Israel, all things that were happening, the question was, listen, we may come to a time where we don't have anybody that has the authority to this. What are we going to do? Okay, they can't do it. We can, but we're there was a problem. So again, in this generation of Rav Kahana Rav Pupa, there's a Rabbi Hillel who was a descendant of Hillel that we talked about, who lived like 300 years earlier. And what he did is he got people together and they calculated the calendar. We follow today that calculation that he made. What they did is made a calendar, and they declared that when the moon was supposed to be seen, they declared new moons on these dates, and they set the calendar at that time. And because they had the authority to do it as the rabbis in Israel, and they felt that they did it, and that's a calendar we follow today. You can buy a Jewish calendar, and it's all based on the calculations that they have. And these calculations are very, very complex, but they are very, very exact also. Okay? New moons come up, although we're talking about a time of like 1,700 years, 1,700 years since it. The new moon comes up at the time when they say it does. They calculated all these things. So that was an important event, but it was also telling us something, and that is that there was coming to an end of the certain power, the certain levels of learning. It's coming to an end in Israel. They no longer could maintain the yeshivas as they had, but then we had the yeshivas in Sirapambadisa. Now, after the time of Rabbi Hillel or Rav Kana Pupa, the next generation was Ashi, again, a very significant figure in the Talmud. Of Ashi is essentially the last generation of Amaduam of a great level. In his time, they were compiling the Talmud in Babylonia, what became our Babylonian Talmud. They had the arguments that were in the Yerushalmi also, or most of them, and they put it together and with the discussion so that they could come to conclusions. Okay. And the last generation was basically Rav Ashi's son, Rav Ashi, and Rafram, and they basically closed the Talmud. It was finalized, essential finalization there, and that was somewhere around 500, the end of the 5th century, that 5th century. Okay, let's stop now because we're going to enter another period of time which I'm almost certain none of you have ever heard about. So if this question again, now when we come to the age of the end of Amaruam and the writing down of the Talmud, we are starting a new period. Okay? The Talmud becomes to us like the Mishnah was to the rabbis of the Talmud. When they realized that we were at the Mishnah and they realized that it was over, that a new period had occurred because the level of learning had a fall. The same thing occurs right now with the Talmud being ended. Okay? So we're going to go on what happens to then. And I'll take a few questions if there's any questions. I know it's a lot to take in with things, but again, Janice, if you want to ask a question, just take off your mute. I can't read lips, so it's
okay.
Okay.
I was just wanting you to say to me again what date it was, which century it was that the calendar was changed.
Okay, the calendar was changed. Hillel lived like in the middle of the 4th century, sometime in the 4th century. Many of these dates, many of the dates I don't have exact. I do have actually a book in Ivrit on Jewish history, but the dates aren't so much important as to recognize what's going on. Okay, there was a recognition among the rabbinic authorities at the time that the level of learning, the level of authority that they'd had at one time is coming to an end. Just like we see the beginning, there was a level of authority of the rabbis of the Talmud recognizing that the authority and the knowledge of the rabbis from the Mishnah were different than theirs, and they cannot argue with them. So with the coming of the Talmud, we have the same thing. Okay, you cannot argue with them. You could, take one view or another. You could try and clarify what these views are. That's what happens in all commentaries efforts. But the level of authority has changed. Okay? The authority now, nobody can come today and say, listen, the Talmud says this, I don't agree with that. The authority ended because they recognized that their level of learning was not going to happen anymore. The center of learning being Israel was now being moved to Babylonia. Things were changing. The outside world was changing, forcing certain changes on the people. From this time on, you don't really find any rabbis in Israel of any importance until basically the Ottoman Empire allowed Jews to come from Spain into that area. Okay, and settled. And from then until that time, the Ottomans took over Constantinople in 1450, I believe it was. 1492, the Jews were expelled from Spain. And then we're going to go into this history later on, just, but from then until the Ottoman Empire, I don't know of any significant, rabbis from Israel living in Israel. And if you know the history of what's going on with the Byzantine Empire and then the Persians and the eventually Arabs coming in, and Arab persecutions, and then there wasn't really a place that anything could really happen like that. Okay, I mean there were rabbis who came there, like the Rambam is buried in Tiberias. There's other rabbis who fled there. We're talking about real yeshivas, real centers of learning like that, like we had we're going to go and talking about now, that exists in Sur Pumbedisa in Babylonia. Okay, those kinds of things didn't exist. So there was a clear change in what was going on based on, what's going on around them and how the communities were not able to maintain the same stability. In order to have your tradition work right, in order to be able to claim the same type of authority from previous generations, have a certain type of stability. Okay, and that was coming to the end in the land of Israel. Okay, so it moved to Persia. Persia was much better at that time, although we're going to see there were some persecutions also that were going on. But essentially, Persia, they had these yeshivas, Sir and Pumbedisa, and they were able to function.
Mm.
That's why, rather than just going through rabbis from generation to generation, trying to get what the historical what's going on, because you have to understand what's going on. Why would a rabbi say he no longer has authority? Because the ability of learning just dropped. Okay, it's like now we see from after the World War II, the Holocaust, both the Jews from Europe and the Jews of Arab lands were totally sent exiled from where they were. They came into different places, America, Israel, and so it's totally different. It's significant. I mean, in my lifetime, I've seen people who came from before the war, who learned from before, and people who, it's just qualitatively different. Okay, just qualitatively different. It's not that these people don't learn, they can't find, but you can see qualitative differences. So there's a certain degree of honesty among the Jewish rabbinic authorities that they recognize, hey, we are no longer on that level that we were before. And we're not going to claim for ourselves the authority from them. It's like when the prophecy ended with the men of the Great Assembly, they realized, after the destruction of the temple, we don't have that same thing that we had before. It's a new world. That's why you don't really see prophets like they had. Nobody speaks, says, God said to me this. You don't see that. Even New Testament doesn't even have that. Because it's subtly recognizing the fact that we knew at that time that type of communication directly from God to a person didn't exist anymore. Why? Because things changed. Things changed over time. And so when the Talmud got written down finally, the end of that period, the end of Ulam, it was a recognition that from now on, it's just not the same anymore. Okay?
What are some of the best? I'm sure there's a lot and mountains of it, but I'm wondering, where's a good place for someone just starting to learn all of this? Where's a good place to go to?
Oh, we haven't even gone down to today yet. We can tell you about them. We got another 1,500 years to get to today, and these 1,500 years are packed with a lot more stuff than we did until now. Okay, so let's leave that kind of question until we get to end, and then we could talk. There are history books, by the way, out there. There are history books out there. I just from authoritative. So Archibald, I think, probably has something. I know they have something on the Rishonim. They have on the early Achronim. There is Zechariah Fendel has a book with something, but some of these books are just like almost impossible to get because Jewish history is like we don't give classes in history. We have classes in Talmud. It's only when it comes. I mean, I have a book in Hebrew. It's a 3-volume in Hebrew. History of the Jewish people. That's got a lot of stuff, but it's in Hebrew. It's not in English. Okay, I got it many years ago. It's sort of interesting to look into, and that goes really much more in depth. I mean, really, really. I mean, it goes to the point of saying this rabbi was this guy, and this was his students. And you see exactly where it is. I'm not going to be able to do that because that would be a class that would take a year or two just to do. If we're doing it only once a month, it'll take a year or two. But essentially, what I'm just trying to give you a taste for is how there actually is a real tradition and why it is we don't argue with the Talmud anymore, why we can't argue with the Talmud. It's we just don't learn as much. Okay, we just don't have that level of learning. And that's something that, we don't understand. And, it's sometimes very difficult to understand why it is that someone say, well, I just can't do it because, it's not that I'm, it's not, not smart. It's just the level of learning, the level of things that are going on. Our society is so different. Okay. And you just, I mean, I could see it because of the people that I from before the Holocaust and after the Holocaust are just totally different. Anyone who's born in America after the war, just totally different people from before the war. Now, Israel, it's maybe like a generation more, a generation two more until they're getting towards that. But in Yerushalayim, for example, there's people I see there. They're still sort of more halfway than much more whatever. But still, essentially, you can see the difference. And the important thing to know is when the Talmud was ended, the reason why Talmud was ended is because, number one, it had to be written down because there were more persecutions in Persia at the time, and you didn't want the things to be lost. And also a recognition, hey, we're just not on the same level as these people are. Something is fundamentally changing. And this is something the Jewish people recognize. There's a few more periods we're going to come into. But each and every period, what happens is something happens sociologically to cause a fundamental overturning of the type of life the Jewish people were living. And that makes it, much more difficult to continue the same type of situation was before. Let me go. Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think we're very blessed to have had all these amazing men, people over the generations, that have been so faithful in keeping the truth for us in the Talmud and in the Mishnah and coming from the Torah. We are so blessed.
Well, you understand that there's a certain perspective that's important. This you started seeing in the Christianity we came from. A recognition that I'm just, I just am just a person. I don't have the ability to say, I don't think you were right. Or what, because these people were just the recognition that you are part of a chain of tradition that goes down, that chain that goes back all about the motion, but understanding also that each, generation, each period, you're not on the same level, you're actually on a lower level, and you recognize that. You're farther away from it, and so you're on a lower level. But still, you follow what's been handed down. Well, as we get into the later periods of time, I want to try and get to a certain period of time now, so I don't want to get too much hung up on it, because I want to get to the end of the yeshivas in Babylonia, Sir Pumbedisa, which is still 700 years away from where we're at now. 700. Well, we started. We're up to the 5th century, so 5th century to the 11th century. We're a few hundred years. Okay, so
Right.
now there are two periods we have to discuss. The first period is a relatively short one. It takes in basically the 6th and the 7th century. This is called the Rabbinus Havaroi, the rabbis who are basically explainers of things. What does that mean? During this period of time, what was going on is we had the Talmud, but it was clarifying the text, making sure we had the text correctly, and making sure that I was making a few notes. There's certain things in the Talmud where there's dots there that's separating the arguments. It's like didn't have things separate. They sort of make the format of the Talmud better. Okay, distinguishing the Mishnah from the Talmud, what's being discussed, putting it in order. If you learn the Talmud today, you'll learn, and it'll get up a certain point, then it'll stop and start a different discussion. And you have a few words before that discussion starts. And all the things that they did in order to make the Talmud something that's easier to learn. That followed basically that period of time of 200 years. Now, in that 200 years, there were a lot of problems. It's probably around 5 generations, but, there were problems. First of all, because of persecution, the yeshivas in Sur Pumbedisa were closed at the beginning of the 6th century. Okay. Around 530, the yeshiva in Nahardua was opened again. Remember, we talked about before the yeshiva in Nahardua was actually closed the past. Let me see where it was. Nadua was closed in 259. It was destroyed to be reopened again in 530. So it was closed for a period of almost 300 years. Then, the Jewish people started having persecution in Babylonia. However, certain provinces were closed, but Nahardua opened up. Pumbedisa opens itself up again for a second time in 589. Persecutions were a little bit less. Sur opens up 609. And then the Yeshiva Nadua joins together with Pumbedisa in 660. Okay, very important. So we have these two during this period of time while this activity is going on. Persia is not being as friendly as it was before. Shivas were closed, she was open. It's a time of somewhat of turmoil, but basically they accomplished their job, getting the Talmud on firm footing. Okay. This period ends, and we start another period of time. This is the period we call the period of the Ga'anin. It goes from approximately the year 690 to the year 1040 when Rabbi Gun dies. So we're talking from going from late 7th century to the 11th century, okay? And this was the central authority for Jewish people. Now, at this time, the Jewish people were in many different places. They were now in Europe, in Germany. They already had the cities in Mainz was one of the big cities where people were living. There were Jews who were living in Spain. Okay, during this time, we're going to find that the Muslims, invade Spain and take it over. And there's a mixed history. We're going to find out about that also when we discuss it. Mixed history, which comes in later. It's not going to be today. We're not going to get to it. Just trying to get through the Goyim and talking the period of time of the Goyim. So in Spain, North Africa, there were Jewish people there, but again, they weren't at the center. The center of gravity, if you want to say, was in Babylonia. During the period they had Goyim. And so let's go through some of them, because I'll tell you, as I tell the story, we'll go on. Okay, so what's important to understand is that, first of all, throughout the period of the Goyim, there were two main yeshivas in Sura and Pumbedisa. The head of the yeshiva, was called the Goyim. Goyim means somebody who's like a really big scholar. And he would be somebody who knew the whole Talmud. Everything, he would know the whole Talmud. Okay? And he was the one who would be teaching in the yeshivas and from generation to generation. And there was just, again, from the work 690 to 1040, the generations with some closings and open again, but essentially from there were main yeshivas. Okay? Now, and not only were they the legal authorities, but they're also the spiritual heads. And we're going to see some discussion about that. I'm going to talk about specifically one of the Goyim being a spiritual, but they were the center of Judaism. Okay, questions would come from all around the world. They would come there, and the definitive answers would come from the yeshivas. Okay, it was no longer in Israel, central authority. Babylonia had somewhat of a thing in yeshivas there, but now the yeshivas were much more of a thing, and that was what they had there. So I'm just going to mention a few of them who, the reason why I'm choosing these people out is because they were not because the other ones weren't great scholars and stuff like that and not very important. But if I was going to go, this is not a history class. This is a class of giving you an idea of basically where Noahide laws are coming from. So my emphasis is going to be more on things that are legal material than otherwise, but they affect mostly Judaism. These people were treating Jews. They weren't treating Noahide laws at all. They were teaching Judaism. But this is also a tradition which is going to be built upon when the Rambam, for example, talks about Noahide laws. It's based on all these things that are coming up until his generation. So let me just mention a few ones. One of them in around the year he became Gaon in Pumbedisa in Riyah 60 was Achai Gaon. Achai Gaon wrote a very important work called the Shaltos. Shaltos means questions in Aramaic. He basically is questioning and answering. This is a type of literature which is going to come up, the responsive literature. Like you've heard maybe we talk about responsive. This is when it starts. People would send questions to Babylonia, and they would get the responses. the work Shaltos is really one of the first works of actual types of responses. Okay, and these are going to become very much. We're going to find a lot of rabbis in later generations. But this is where it starts. The idea. So when you hear somebody talks about responsive literature, you should think about, oh, this goes all the way back, to that's the 7th century, and we're in the 21st century. We're going back all the way back to 1400, 1400 years ago. The idea of sending letters to rabbis and getting your answers because you didn't live there, you had to get it somehow. This all starts from then. Judaism, everything goes, like that. That's the way it is. Okay. The next important rabbi was Rabbi Hidai going. He was going from about 757, so about 100 years, similar time to Rabbi Chagan. Both of them died actually in the same year. Rabbi Hidai going was in Surah. He wrote a very important work called Hilchos Gedolos. This was the first work of collecting Jewish law in one place where you can look it up what the law was. It was very primitive. We're going to find out people who do much better things, and that's what we use today is things that were made, 700-800 years after that. Jewish history is always in hundreds of years. 10-20 years doesn't begin, hundreds of years. So later on, we'll get to the Maimonides, Mishnah Torah, and eventually to the Shulchan Aruch, which is going to be like 1400s, 15th century, say. But here we're still in the 8th century. So we're talking about 600 years later when it is. But this all starts from here. The idea of having works which do that started from that time. The next rabbi of importance we should know of is of Amram Gaon. Of Amram Gaon was the Gaon in Surah, and he became Gaon 928. So pretty close to the end of this. Excuse me. He was going from. I skipped to somebody. He was going from 858. Okay, pretty much in the middle of the period of time. What was Amram Gaon most known for? He was the one who produced the first siddur. People in Spain sent a question to, Babylonia. What is the proper order of prayers? They've been following customs that they had, but we want to know what is really the proper order of prayers. What's supposed to be doing based on the Talmud, just to ensure we're him. So he sent it to Spain. That's the first siddur we know. I actually have it here. Somebody put it, but that was the first siddur. From that time, we have actually the print and writing up of Siddurim. In Europe, they have Siddurim. They're very much, but so that's the first time. So the first siddur didn't come into existence until the 9th century. Okay. The next one who I want to spend a little bit more time on is Reb Saadia Gaon. And Reb Saadia Gaon was phenomenal in many ways. Obviously, being the Gaon who he was halacha, he was the only Gaon that I know of who actually traveled around to communities. Okay, the other Gaonim, they were in the yeshivas, but they didn't travel around so much. And Saadia Gaon was in the yeshiva Surah, and he would travel around. He went to Europe. He would travel around to different communities, and just to connect with the people. I don't know how much travel, but we know from traditions, of course, he traveled on. Now, of course, he was involved in halachic stuff and things like that. But also, very importantly, he was involved in philosophical works. His work was one of the first Jewish philosophers that we know of. Okay, Judaism didn't have any philosophy per se. Okay, and books on philosophy only really come into relevance when you're dealing with people who have different religions and say, well, why are you different from us? So he wrote a work called Amina Vidayas. He wrote it in Arabic because by that time, that area was under the Arabs, on the Muslims. Okay, and he talks about the fundamentals of the Jewish faith. It's very, very similar to Maimonides. But when we're talking about religion, Noahides, I'm going to go through the fundamentals of Maimonides, some of the other different views to give an idea of what Judaism believes is the truth about a number of issues. Okay, but he was the first one who wrote a work of that nature. Okay, many years before Maimonides. Okay, he became the Goyen in from 928. Okay, um, he died in 942, but he was deposed and came back. There was a lot of politics going along at that time. Again, we could see if we look at the situation, the Persians, but when the Muslims took over, we could see that there's a slow degeneration over time. Okay. Now, the last Goyen was of High Goyen in the city of Pampedisa. He died in 1038. He became Goyen after his father. His father was also Goyen. In many ways, his father is actually more important historically for Jewish people than him. He wrote a number of works, but High Goyen was the last one. And he died in 1038. He became gone in 1003. So he was gone for many years. We have certain things, responses. Again, all these gone and wrote responses, but we don't have all of them. His responses, I think we do have. He was very important for many reasons. Actually, there are many people who are descended from him who live today. People can trace the descent back to him. It's an interesting fact, but it's not really relevant to him very much. But again, he was essentially the last of the Goyim, and the reason why is because at that time the persecution under the Muslims was very big, where they had somewhat independence before then. We're entering a period of time where they didn't have it, and you're getting the invasions from the Mongols, you're getting the invasions from different people in that period of time, which causes all kinds of turnovers and stuff like that in that period. If you want to look at the historical period of time, I can't remember when it started, but first of all, under Muhammad, the Muslims spread out, took over Persian area, but then there were invasions from Mongolia. And you get like Attila the Hun, for example, was from that area. Names like this. You look at the history of time, you see that from this time on, there were many, many invasions from that area, and so the disruptions, the ability to have a central authority was coming to an end. Okay, after the fall, things split off. There's a story told of the four captives, where there were four people who had come from Babylonia, who were captured by Arab pirates, and they were sold in different areas. One was sold in Spain, the other in Egypt, the other in Tunisia, and the third one, we don't know what his name is, but he was sold in Rome, affecting there. And through this, the authority started spreading out. It became decentralized. Until now, we've been always talking about there's some kind of a centralized authority, whether it was in the land of Israel, first Babylonia, the end of Israel, or when it went to Babylonia with the Shivas. With the closing of the Shivas, with the ending of what was going on in the Goyim, things started spreading out. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't people living in other lands. That's there were, and many of them are very important. I'm just going to mention a few of them, just so you know. In North Africa, there's a very, very famous person named Danish ben Labrat. We actually sing on Shabbos one of the religious poems he made. It's one of the songs people sing on Shabbos. Okay, we're talking about somebody who's been dead over 1,000 years, but it's part of the things that I sing it every Shabbos. It's very difficult because they write in a very difficult Hebrew, but it's sing every Shabbos in many places. Another person important was a grammarian from Spain, Menachem ben Sarach. Menachem ben Sarach you find all over Rashi's commentary. He was a grammarian, and so when we talk about that. Oh, I forgot to mention that the Tzaddik Gaon also wrote commentaries on the Bible, which I have. I wrote in Aramaic. So we're going to go with Malcolm was a grammarian. So when Rashi talks about grammatical points with regards to verses in the Torah, for example, he will bring Menachem ben Sarach says this. You see, when you say the Menachem and Rashi, that's who he's talking about. somebody who did like a couple hundred years before him, but he was a grammarian from Spain, and his influence on Rashi was his grammatical commentaries very much. Besides that, there's two other people which were important for the development of Judaism in Germany. The first one was Kulan of Luka. He was sometime in the 10th century, and he came from the famous Kulanim's family, who were Jews who came from a family that was from Israel, exiled to Italy and lived there. But the story is told that Charlemagne invited him to come there. And he was like a catalyst in the Jewish community there, of a Torah scholar. There's another Torah scholar, which also mentioned, Shimon Hagula, was a Talmudist from the 10th century. Same time as the yeshivas in Babylonia. So even though there were yeshivas in Babylonia, there were still local Talmidim Chachamim who through the development of the local customs, but still the central point was the Gaonim in Surim Pamadis, which was actually Persia at the time, then became under whatever, I don't remember the name of the caliphate, maybe the Abbasid caliphate at the time before the Mongols came. I really don't remember which was. But again, they were in the central. But again, that came to an end. Haigulan was the last one. And after Haigulan, we start another period of time of decentralization. And we're going to do this next time. I'm not going to complete it now. This generation called the Rishonim. Rishonim being the first ones. And that covers a period of about 400 years, from the fall of Babylonia as a center of Judaism to the dispersal, where we see things different. Now, one of the first things that we know here is, because it becomes decentralized, we find the Jewish people, rather than having it one center point, they can have a number of different centers of gravity. You find Europe, Germany, France. You find Provence. You're going to find North Africa for a while, and you find Spain during this period of the Rishonim. Each one of them is going to be the start of essentially what you can see today, different parts of Judaism, where there's differences. But that's where it starts. Once the yeshivas, once the period of the Gaonim ends, that starts a dispersal and a decentralization. Rabbinic authority, rather than being in one central place, becomes rabbinic authority in multiple places. Now we can see how things develop from there. But that's pretty much what I wanted to cover today, because I can go on another few more hours, but I want to keep it an hour and a half. So are there any questions? I'm sure there's lots of things you've heard that you've never heard before. But again, the point of it is that history is here to understand the tradition, how we're getting to where we are. Central authority, where they can go from there. And then we're going to see the next time it's been dispersed, and there's going to be a lot more rabbis because there's a lot more places to cover. There was no central authority, so it's much more decentral. But we still see generation for generation, whether it's in Germany, whether it's in Spain, from generation to generation, going down. Okay? And of course, we're going to discuss local events are going to have a lot to do with it. So just like we see local events had a lot to do with this, what's going on till now, we can see that. So the Gaonim basically end because of the Mongol invasions and things that were going on in that period, which really was just falling apart. And when that happens, central power is going to be from Europe, Germany, France, and different places. Okay, that's all I have to say. Certainly I'll open up for questions now.
Very good stuff, Rabbi. Very good stuff. Thank you so much.
Yeah. It's very interesting to note that much of what we take for granted today really only goes back to the work of the Gaonim after Talmud. Having the concept of having a siddur, state siddur. They used to have somebody who led prayers based on whatever the custom had been there, but now they had more of a formalized siddur that never happened before. Idea of responsive works. People always asked in the yeshivas, but they didn't have the kind of thing that was going now. People asked questions from the yeshiva. Didn't have people from outside asking questions, and that was it became a very because of being exiled. That became more of a thing, and all these different types of things. Philosophy started, Jewish philosophy. We didn't have that. And that only lasted about 500 years. After the fall of the exile from Spain, you really don't have philosophy. Philosophy it took up more in Sephardic lands. We're going to see about that than it took up in Europe.
Yeah, beautiful thoughts, though.
Now, we still haven't gone anywhere near what's going on today. We're still in history, we're still 1,000 years ago. So, you know, we haven't really gotten anything now, although we've covered a lot of years. We still haven't gotten now. What's going to happen now is going to be much more what we're going to do next time is going to be much more relevant to now, because you're going to see a lot of names you've heard of coming from different places, and you're going to understand what the difference is, what's going on now. Okay.
Right, but I think what you shared today is more critical for those coming out of a Christian paradigm to really understand yeah, more of the texture and the feel and the setting and yeah, what the Jewish people faced. And yeah, for sure, beautiful stuff though.
Okay.
But-
Any more questions? If not, I'm going to shut off the recording. No? Ronald? Ronald's sitting there looking like, oh, I've read that already. I know about it. Come to something new already.
I'm just enjoying the fact that, you know, like I can see why there's not a lot of questions, because we're basically having a history lesson here, but at least we get an
Yeah.
understanding of how it's been
Yeah.
passed.
It's not disputable,
through
yeah.
and
Yeah.
how
Yeah. Again, the most important thing I think you should get from that is that when you hear somebody talking about an oral law, oral tradition, that's not just a Talmud. That's something's living. Tradition, you know, it evolves as time goes. We can't disagree with the Talmud. That's true, but it's still part of a process. Okay, and that's very important to understand. Okay, when we talk about our oral traditions, you know, it's something that has an element. Again, we have the rabbinic authority that we talked about, but then we have things happen in time. Now we've gotten to a time where we'd once had much more centralized authority. We're now going to move to a time where we don't have as much centralized authority. So while we're still, everything's going back to the Talmud, you're going to find certain differences in different places. Okay, that are going to come up of, post-Talmud issues are going to be answered in Germany different than in Spain. Okay, a lot of the discussions that in the Talmud was talking about people, Caleb asked earlier about, does it write about sociological conditions? Yeah, the Talmud talks about certain things, but you're going to find when now we go into Germany, when you go into to Spain, different places, it's not the same as it was there. So how you deal with these new things, each, when there was a centralized authority, certain things were a certain way. Now there's a decentralized authority, so you're going to start to see the differences. And that's what we're going to talk about next time. We were showing them, and then we'll talk about finding them in the period of time after that, which is closer to our time. But you'll see some of the later names will be more familiar to you. You've heard of Rashi, you've all heard of. So Rambam, you've heard of. Maimonides, you've heard of. Some of the names are going to become names that you've heard of more, but the context in which they live, how many people know about the context of Maimonides? Okay, he came from Spain, but how much do you really know about? We're going to discuss that also because it has to do with a lot of things that are going on in the halachic tradition, in the legal traditions, and events in the world as they are affecting. And if you thought you had a class in Jewish history, you have not. I only picked and choose, certain events, certain things that are going on that are of significance affecting what's going on in the Jewish people. And to get an idea of just basically, when we talk about different things, what we're talking about. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, then I am going to first of all, I'm going to start the recording.